it is my great honor to welcome Heather Battaly. She is professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut. She specializes in epistemology, ethics, and virtue theory. She is one of the leading researchers in the world on the concept of intellectual humility and epistemic vice. Her work influences research in philosophy, psychology, and education on intellectual humility and the teaching of intellectual character traits. She has been co-investigator for a Templeton grant and principal investigator for a Spencer grant. She is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Philosophical Research, as well as an associate editor for the Journal of the American Philosophical Association, and she's contributed many publications to the field, and it's just a great honor to have her with us. So she's going to be presenting her talk on how close-mindedness ruins the mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. And thanks to the Philosophy Department at APU for having me, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm thrilled that you're here today. Okay, did you all get the ridiculously long handout? Okay, so I'll move quickly. All right, so I'll move quickly. I'm going to try to keep it fun, and I'll move around. All right, and I will stop after 45 minutes at the most. Is that cool? Yeah, okay, great. So how close-mindedness ruins your mind. I've become really interested in thinking about vices lately. I think that vices in general, whatever kind of vices, are qualities that make us bad people. I think that intellectual vices are qualities that make us bad thinkers. So I am part of a small crew of people. We call ourselves the Vice Squad. And we're working on a developing area in epistemology and the theory of knowledge called vice epistemology. So I'm hoping that this paper is going to make a contribution to that area. And this is stuff I'm working on right now. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. I'd love to get your feedback. It's definitely going to help me in my thinking, and my email's on here. So even if you don't get to ask a question later and you want to talk to me about this stuff, please email me. Okay, so I wanted to start with a paradigm of close-mindedness. So I think most of us are aware of people like Mike. Okay, so if you look at the top, Mike believes that poor Americans are simply lazy. Some of us probably know people like Mike. And even if we don't know people like Mike, we're aware that people like Mike exist. So like many upper-class Americans of his generation, Mike grew up believing that the US is a land of opportunity where people wouldn't be poor if they worked hard. He's stuck with these beliefs throughout his adulthood and is consistently unwilling to engage seriously with ideas or evidence to the contrary. So he dismisses any competing ideas that cross his path. He doesn't evaluate their merits. So when the conversation turns to low wages as a cause of poverty, he just deems that nonsense and shuts down and closes himself off. When he sees an article arguing that lack of opportunity contributes to poverty, he thinks it's silly, and he scrolls past it. Now, he recognizes that such ideas compete with his own ideas, and he rejects those ideas because they seem implausible, okay? So I think Mike is close-minded, at least with respect to the causes of poverty in the United States. And I think this is a pretty paradigmatic case of close-mindedness. Okay, so we can use this case to help us try to figure out what close-mindedness is and what dogmatism is, and how these things ruin our minds when they do. So I've got a summary here in Roman numeral 2 of what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes. So the first thing I do is I adopt a working analysis of what close-mindedness is. I think it's an unwillingness or inability to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options. I know that's like a mouthful and technical, but we're going to go through it, and I'm going to try to help you get a sense of what I've got in mind here. I think Mike has a familiar species, a subset of close-mindedness. He's dogmatic. And I think dogmatism, so it's one way to be closed-minded. I think dogmatism is an unwillingness to engage with relevant alternatives to a belief that you already hold. Okay. I think the disposition of closed-mindedness ruins our minds when it's an intellectual vice. And I'm going to talk about 3 different ways in which closed-mindedness could be an intellectual vice and 3 different kinds of intellectual vice. And then the last thing I thought I would ask is whether you think closed-mindedness always ruins your minds, or whether you think there's some occasions when it's okay to be closed-minded. And if you do think that, why or when, right? What might make it okay to be closed-minded, okay? And could it even be that there's some situations in which closed-mindedness isn't an intellectual vice, but it's an intellectual virtue? Okay, so that's what we're going to end with. Okay, so first, the working analysis of what closed-mindedness and dogmatism are. Okay, so we know with this Mike example, he's unwilling to engage seriously with alternatives to a belief he already has, okay? So let's use this case to sort of look at the features of closed-mindedness and dogmatism. Dismissing relevant alternatives to a belief you have, right, is one way to be closed-minded and one way to be dogmatic. But it's not the only way to be closed-minded. And interestingly, it's not even the only way to be dogmatic. So closed-mindedness is broader, much broader. It's a general unwillingness or inability to engage with relevant intellectual options. And dogmatism is a tiny bit broader too. It's not just dismissing. So it's an unwillingness to engage seriously with relevant alternatives to a belief you hold. Okay, so we're going to look at 4 features of Mike's case, and we're going to see that none of these 4 features is required for closed-mindedness, meaning you could be closed-minded and not be like Mike in these ways. Okay, and 2 of these 4 features are not required for dogmatism. Okay, so one way to think about what we're doing is we're sort of using this case to home in on what closed-mindedness really is and what dogmatism really is. Okay? Okay, so the first feature, we're already on 3A. Look at that, we're cruising. Okay, so having beliefs about the topic. Okay, so this isn't required for closed-mindedness, I think, and isn't required, well, it is required for dogmatism. So not required for closed-mindedness, but is required for dogmatism. All right, so in Mike's case, he already has a belief. He believes that poverty in the US is simply caused by laziness, not by anything else, right? And he dismisses relevant alternatives to that belief, and in doing that, he's being closed-minded. But I think closed-mindedness doesn't require already having a belief about the topic. So consider somebody else, Michelle, who has no beliefs about what causes American poverty, right? Maybe she didn't grow up in the US. She's never studied the United States, right? Or never has studied poverty, right? She doesn't have any beliefs about what causes American poverty, okay? Still, Michelle, in confronting evidence about what the causes of American poverty for the very first time, might be closed-minded in the way she handles that evidence. So for instance, she might ignore evidence in favor of structural causes of poverty, like low wages or something like that, okay? So even though she doesn't already have a belief, she could be closed-minded in the way she handles evidence when she's confronting a topic for the first time, okay? Okay, so dogmatism, I think, does require already having a belief about the topic at hand. So I think we ordinarily think that to be dogmatic, there has to be something. There has to be an object, something in your head that you're dogmatic about, like a belief, or we call these things dogmas sometimes, right? So I think first case, having beliefs about the topic, not required for closed-mindedness, is required for dogmatism. Second feature of Mike's case, so ideas and evidence. So in Mike's case, he's dismissing ideas and evidence that compete with his belief, right? The belief that he already holds, okay? And Michelle, we see, if you buy the Michelle case, then in that case, she's not ignoring ideas and evidence that compete with a belief that she already holds, but she's still ignoring ideas and evidence. She's running across this information for the first time, she's studying it for the first time, and she's still ignoring it. Okay, but Michelle's case does something interesting because it makes us think about how we might be closed-minded in the way that we conduct our inquiries more generally, okay? So we might be closed-minded not just in the way that we handle ideas and evidence, but we could be closed-minded with respect to which questions we ask. We could be closed-minded with respect to which sources we consult. We could be closed-minded with respect to which methods we use, which projects, which inquiries we pursue to begin with, all kinds of things. So if this is right, then what it shows is that the locus of closed-mindedness isn't restricted to ideas and evidence. Okay, so its locus will include what I'm calling intellectual options. The category of intellectual options will include ideas and evidence, but it's bigger than that. It'll include questions and projects you might pursue and sources and methods, okay? There's a nice quote from Robert Roberts and Jay Wood. They have a terrific book on intellectual virtue, and I just wanted to read a quote from them. So they employ a very similar concept called intellectual rigidity, okay? And in describing intellectual rigidity, they say that a subset of it is what they call comprehensional rigidity. And they give some examples to illustrate this idea. So this is a quote from Roberts and Wood. Their archetypes of comprehensional rigidity include these. Quote, the analytic philosopher who can make no sense of Plato or Hegel. The continental philosopher unable to appreciate Quine. The neuroscientist who thinks that philosophers have nothing to contribute to the study of human emotion. The 19th century Anglo-American who thought blacks were uneducable. Okay, so I'm in line here with Roberts and Wood. Okay, so we both think, they think intellectual rigidity isn't just about ideas and evidence. I think closed-mindedness isn't just about ideas and evidence, it's broader. Likewise for dogmatism. So we can come up with another example. We've got Mike, Michelle, now think of Michaela. So imagine Michaela forms the belief that the sole cause of American poverty is laziness. And after she forms that belief, we use this expression, she just puts her fingers in her ears, right? Or we sometimes use the expression, she hides her head in the sand, right? And in doing that, she's completely shutting herself off to any ideas or evidence that might come in, either supporting or undermining, interestingly, but she's also closing herself off for any further questions, contacting or consulting any further sources, using any further methods. So she's closing herself off not just to ideas and evidence, but to a lot more intellectual options. Okay, so second feature, the locus of ideas and evidence, not required for closed-mindedness, not required for dogmatism. Third feature, engaging with intellectual options. This isn't required for closed-mindedness, isn't required for dogmatism. So we see in Mike's case, he's dismissing options that compete with the belief he already holds, okay? And we really need to talk to philosophers of language here to figure out all the distinctions, but really roughly, When you're dismissing a belief, we can say you're still engaging with it, right? Mike is recognizing that this evidence and these ideas compete with the belief he already holds. He's recognizing they compete with that belief, and he's rejecting them. He's thinking that they're false on those grounds, okay? So he is in some way engaging with these alternatives, these intellectual options, but he's not engaging with them seriously, right? His engagement is just purely superficial. He's not evaluating them on their merits. He's not trying to figure out whether they're legitimate or not, okay? He's not weighing them. So he's engaging, but he's not engaging seriously. But interestingly, I think, closed-mindedness and dogmatism don't even require that much. They don't require engaging, because we can be closed-minded and dogmatic by failing to engage with sources, with questions, with ideas and evidence, with methods. So there are a couple different ways we could fail to engage. We could ignore sources, methods, questions, ideas, evidence, right? So, and again, here's where we need the philosophers of language, but roughly, I think in ignoring, we're doing something like recognizing the idea or evidence, but then just immediately looking somewhere else, right? We don't even bother to render a belief about whether it's true or false. We don't render any judgment about it. If we ignore it, we see it, but then look away, okay? Something like that. We might be oblivious to relevant options. So I may not, if I'm somebody who believes that the cause of poverty in the United States is laziness, simply and only laziness, then I might be oblivious to potential defeaters of that belief, right? So when somebody else comes to me and says, but Heather, right, these folks are below the poverty line and they're working 3 jobs. And I may just say, I don't see that. I don't see that they're working hard. I don't think they're working hard. I still think they're lazy. They're not working hard enough, you might say, okay? So somebody who's oblivious might not even notice defeaters. They might not even notice sources. I think this is a really interesting case. So somebody who's oblivious, closed-minded and oblivious, they're failing to engage with relevant sources, right? They may not even see people below the poverty line as sources about what's causing their poverty. They may think that they're not going to be sincere because they want to hold on to their entitlements or something like that. I think we hear that language in politics. So, and more broadly, there's this really terrific work done by Miranda Fricker, who has a great book on testimonial injustice and epistemic injustice. Sometimes when we have identity prejudice, we fail to see women and people of color as sources of knowledge. And when that's systematic, when it tracks women and people of color around the world, so it doesn't just happen when it's in class, or it happens whenever we're interacting with women and people of color. That's another case where we might be oblivious to sources, right? Okay. And then last, failing to seek out or generate options. So we could also fail to engage by failing to look for alternatives, okay? So the example I have here is, consider a conservative voter who fails to seek out moderate or progressive sources, who fails to look beyond his own echo chamber, who only looks for sources and evidence that confirm his conservative views about poverty. Okay. Okay. So engaging with intellectual options, not required for either one. Unwillingness, last point here. So this is not required for closed-mindedness. I think it is required for dogmatism. So Mike is unwilling to engage seriously with relevant options, right? I think that willful refusal probably is required if for calling somebody dogmatic, but it's not required for close-mindedness in general. So we can be, I think, close-minded as long as if we're willing but unable to engage with relevant intellectual options. This particular point is not so popular among the virtue ethicists. Okay, but here's the idea. So the idea is that Wayne Riggs has this terrific article on insight and open-mindedness, and he gives some examples of people he calls Oblivia and Smugford. And Oblivia and Smugford, like Mike, already have a belief that poverty is caused by laziness, okay? Let's assume, okay? Oblivia and Smugford are willing to engage with relevant alternatives to that belief, okay? But they're not able to. Oblivia, as you might have guessed, isn't able to because she's just oblivious to the alternative. She's just walking through the world clueless about different options. She doesn't see them. Even when they pop up right in front of her, she doesn't see them. She doesn't perceive them, okay? And I think that she, even though she's willing, right? If she's willing but doesn't see them, she fails to consistently engage. And I think in failing to consistently engage with relevant options, she's being close-minded. Smugford does see the options when they pop up, but Smugford has a really high standard for what counts as a plausible option. He's smug. Okay, so what counts as a plausible option for him is it's a really high standard to meet. And so nothing meets it. So he sees options, but they all appear implausible to him. So he's willing to engage with options that are plausible, but nothing seems plausible to him, so he doesn't engage with any options. And again, I think Smugford's close-minded. Okay, last point here. I think that people who are unable to engage with intellectual options because of bad luck in their environments or constitutions also count as close-minded. But there are several buts here. They're not going to be blameworthy in the standard voluntarist sense of blame. Okay, so this means that close-mindedness isn't always going to be blameworthy. Okay. Or at least coming to possess close-mindedness isn't always going to be blameworthy. Once you have it, and you know you have it, you might be blameworthy for not doing anything about it. But coming to get it, you might not be blameworthy for. And as an inability, close-mindedness might be an environmentally produced impairment. It might be something you absorb from your environment. Fricker argues that we absorb testimonial injustice from our environments. And I think close-mindedness can even be the result of a hardwired impairment. But I think in that kind of case, again, it's not blameworthy, and it may not even be a particularly interesting result of a hardwired impairment. It may almost be trivial. So it doesn't have to be a character trait. Okay, so the big takeaway from all this, close-mindedness is an unwillingness or inability to engage seriously with relevant intellectual options. Dogmatism is a subset of that. It's an unwillingness to engage seriously with relevant alternatives to a belief you already hold. The examples that I've used so far, in most of these cases, the people who are being dogmatic have a false belief, right? That American poverty is solely caused by laziness. We know that's not true. Okay, so they have false beliefs. But it's important to point out that we can be dogmatic about true beliefs too, right? So dogmatism isn't keyed to the content of the belief. We can be dogmatic about a false belief. We can be dogmatic about a true belief. Somebody could be dogmatic about their religious beliefs, whether those beliefs turn out to be true or false. I can even be dogmatic about unimportant beliefs. I think I am ridiculously dogmatic about my dog Pixie's behavior. I'm very dogmatic in believing that she's well behaved. And people tell me she is well behaved, so I guess it's a true belief, but I'm still dogmatic about it. I wouldn't hear otherwise. So that's one point. So this doesn't just apply to false beliefs, it applies to true beliefs. Second point, closed-mindedness comes in lots of different forms. We could have closed-mindedness that's pretty domain specific, right? So I might only, well, this isn't true, but I might only be dogmatic about Pixie's behavior. Or I might only be dogmatic about Pixie's behavior and whether Star Trek is a better show than Doctor Who, okay? So it could be relatively domain specific. Closed-mindedness could also be a more general disposition, right? Where somebody is closed-minded no matter what the topic is, okay? Closed-mindedness could also happen as a one-off action. So maybe on a particular occasion, Dr. Vitz and I are arguing heatedly about whether Star Trek is better than Doctor Who. And I, on this one-off occasion, ignore his very well-presented evidence that Doctor Who is better, okay? But I don't tend to ignore it. Normally, I'm happy to engage it, okay? So that would be a closed-minded action. So closed-mindedness comes in all these different forms. And then last, so I can get into this later in greater detail if you'd like to talk about it, but so I think we need to define closed-mindedness and dogmatism in terms of relevant intellectual options. And defining relevance, if you all have ever taken classes in theory of knowledge, you know this is a swamp. Okay, defining relevance is really difficult. You're just wading into a quagmire here. But there's a couple things I want to say. One, I think that we can define it, we could either define it the way epistemic externalists would, or the way epistemic internalists would. Roughly, that means we can say that an option, an intellectual option, like an alternative to a belief, a different idea, or a different source, or a different question, we could say that those things are relevant if they're, in fact, likely to be true, okay? Or if our community reliably believes that they're likely to be true. Or on the other side, the internalist side, we could say they're relevant if we, the agent, the individual person, or our community has good reason to think that they're likely to be true. So those are sort of two main players here with respect to relevancy. I'm not going to argue for either one. I think that no matter which of those options, whichever of those options we choose, the good news is that statements like 2 + 2 = 5, the Holocaust never happened, and the Earth is flat are going to be irrelevant. They're not going to count. And the reason they're not going to count is because they're not true, they're false. We don't have good reason to believe that they're true. Our communities don't have good reason to believe that they're true. Our communities reliably believe that they're false. So on any standard of relevancy that we'd pick, those, in an ordinary environment anyway, those statements like that are going to turn out to be irrelevant. That means that when we ignore those statements, right? When you're walking home to the dorm this afternoon and you see a person out on the quad and they say, 2 + 2 = 5. You can just walk right by. And you're not being closed-minded when you do that because you're not ignoring a relevant option, okay? I think the reason we need this restriction is it would be really weird to say that we're closed-minded whenever we ignore anything, okay? So imagine suppose you're a small-town cop. Okay, you're a small-town police detective. The entire police department is you. It's all on you. Okay, and imagine there's a crime committed in your town and you're trying to figure out who did it. Okay, somebody's house got broken into. Okay, and imagine you're considering different alternatives. But you don't consider the alternative that David Bowie's ghost did it. You wouldn't be closed-minded. We wouldn't call you closed-minded for ignoring that alternative. Why? Because it's not relevant, right? So we need some kind of restriction on relevancy. I think there are super interesting questions about C here, which we can think of as a pervasiveness condition. So if our environment, our epistemic environment, is one where relevant options are absent, think about North Korea, contemporary North Korea, no access to the internet, okay? Or think about 1984, George Orwell's 1984 in Oceania, okay? So lots of options are missing from that environment. You're told one thing and you're told it repeatedly. You're not given options, okay? I think it's a really interesting question to think about whether the absence of options from an environment makes them irrelevant. And on the flip side, I think it's a really interesting question to think about whether the presence, particularly the ubiquity of options in an environment, makes them relevant. So in 1984, freedom is slavery. In 1984, Big Brother is constantly telling the inhabitants that freedom is slavery. Does that, we know that that's false, but does the ubiquity of it in that context, you're constantly hearing it blaring out of every screen, right? Does that make it relevant? Okay, so that's something to think about, epistemically hostile environments. Okay, all right. So I want to say a little bit about intellectual vices. We've talked about what closemindedness and dogmatism is. Quickly, so intellectual vices roughly are qualities that make us bad thinkers. I think there's several different ways that we can be bad thinkers and several different kinds of intellectual vice. So I'm going to talk about three. So the first kind, I just call them effects vices because they have to do with producing bad stuff. Okay, so they're producing bad effects, bad outcomes. So cognitive dispositions might produce a preponderance, that just means more, right? Might produce a preponderance of bad epistemic effects, and these things include false beliefs. They're not limited to that, but they include them, okay? Or they might prevent us from achieving good epistemic effects, like true beliefs or knowledge or understanding, okay? So dispositions can be effects vices whether or not they involve bad epistemic character. If you're familiar with any of the literature in virtue epistemology, effects vices are the analog of reliabilist virtues. So there are some terrific folks who work in that area, Ernest Souza and John Greco, and they think that any quality, roughly any stable quality that produces more true beliefs than false beliefs counts as an intellectual virtue. So effects vices are just the flip side of that, right? They're the contrary. They're claiming that any quality that consistently produces more bad epistemic effects than good ones counts as a vice. Okay, second kind. Oh, questions. Okay, so we should ask, what bad epistemic effects might close-mindedness produce? What bad effects does it produce for the person who is close-minded? And what bad effects does it produce for everybody else when you've got a close-minded person in the environment? Okay. Second type, responsibilist vices. Okay, so here, a disposition could also, or instead, involve bad epistemic character. So bad epistemic motives and values for which the person is blameworthy. Okay, this is the traditional notion of vice in Aristotle, say, okay? So we can ask here, when close-mindedness is a responsibilist vice, which bad motives and values are associated with it? Are these unique to close-mindedness? Are they shared with other epistemic vices? And in what way is the close-minded agent blameworthy for becoming close-minded? Okay. And again, if you've looked at any of the work in intellectual virtue, the analog here are the analogs called responsibilist virtues. So Linda Zagzebski is an advocate of responsibilist virtue, and so is Jason Baer. Okay, and then last, this category is going to be less familiar. So arguably there's a middle ground between effects vices and responsibilist vices. And I'm calling these personalist vices. So these involve bad epistemic character, bad motives and values for which the agent isn't blameworthy. So that's the difference with responsibilist vice, okay? So like responsibilist vices, personalist vices involve having bad motives and bad values, okay, bad character, right? But unlike responsibilist vices, you're not blameworthy for them. And the reason I call them personalist vices is because our epistemic motives and values in general, if we're just talking about our general virtues and vices, not restricting it to intellectual ones, just general ones. Our motives and values express who we are as people. They tell us something about us as people and who we are. Our intellectual motives and values tell us something about who we are as thinkers. Okay, so I just call them personal because they tell us something about the person. So a question here we can ask is whether we see personalist vices in indoctrinated people. And I think we do, we can. So I'm going to suggest that closemindedness can take each of these forms. And we're going to start with effects vices. Okay, so we're cruising through. All right, so being an effects vice, that means that closemindedness would have to produce more bad stuff than good stuff, epistemically. Okay, so here's a bunch of bad things closemindedness can produce. Okay, so, and we're going to start with bad effects that closemindedness can have for the close-minded person herself. Okay, so sustaining false beliefs. So think about Mike's case, right? Mike, because he's closed-minded, because he's shutting himself off from those relevant options, is able to sustain the false belief he already has, okay? Interestingly, I think, this may apply more broadly, and perhaps even to all of us, in failing to look for sources outside our own epistemic bubbles, we may be sustaining false beliefs that we already have, right? So think about where you get your news from, right? Think about where that's coming from. Whether you're getting, most of your news from, one place you check online, or whether you're getting most of your news from some of your social media feeds, right? Think about that. So there's this really cool philosopher named Christopher T. Nguyen who's doing some work on epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, and he argues that we may even be strengthening our confidence in false beliefs when we fail to look beyond our epistemic bubbles. So what happens when you're getting your news from Facebook and solely from Facebook, right? Is that you're friends with your friends on Facebook, probably because you like them. Maybe not all of them, but most of them you probably like, right? You're not friends with them because they're experts in different areas, right? They're not authorities on various things, typically, okay? And so what Nguyen argues is that epistemic bubbles have what he calls bootstrap corroboration. So your beliefs are repeatedly reinforced by what you see in your feed, and yet that corroboration isn't independent, right? Because people are just reposting the same thing over and over and over again. Sort of like when Wittgenstein was talking about justification, and he said, okay, you might get justification for a belief about world events by looking at the newspaper, but you don't get any more justification for it by looking at 50 copies of the exact same newspaper, right? So it seems like here, closed-mindedness might sustain false beliefs and even, in the case of epistemic bubbles, strengthen our confidence in those false beliefs. And that could apply to true beliefs too. Our epistemic bubbles could strengthen our confidence in true beliefs, and the strengthened confidence would still be misplaced in that case, right? Because your corroboration isn't independent. Okay, so second bad thing, obstructing true beliefs and knowledge, okay? So closed-mindedness can prevent us from acquiring true beliefs and knowledge. Mike's dogmatism does that, right? But it can also prevent agents from acquiring true beliefs and knowledge, even when they haven't already made up their minds. That happens in Michelle's case, when she doesn't already have any beliefs about the causes of poverty. Or again, think of the epistemic bubble case. Consider somebody who gets all of his news from Facebook or like a cooler social media site that you guys actually use. Okay, so consider that, okay? And if your feed, if there are big gaps in coverage in your feed, then you're gonna be getting some true beliefs about what's going on in the world from your feed, right? But your failure, your closed-minded failure to seek out alternative sources is going to prevent you from gaining true beliefs about events that aren't in your feed. And some of those might be kind of important. Okay? I think closed-mindedness, this is the third point, can also cause us to acquire new false beliefs. And to illustrate this, I want to look at the case of Samuel A. Cartwright. So here, Cartwright, we see closed-mindedness expanding and compounding his system of false beliefs. So he was a pre-Civil War white American doctor. He was a published academic. He practiced medicine in the South. His writings fall in the category of what we today call scientific racism. So he believed that slaves lacked agency. And when he was confronted with contrary evidence, okay, so there are attempts to escape slavery, to resist oppression in various ways, he did what a dogmatic person would do. He didn't judge escape attempts and resistance of oppression to be agential. He didn't say, oh, right, this shows that slaves are agents. Instead, he judged escape attempts to be manifestation of a mental disorder, which he called dropotomania, that he just made up. He just made it up, okay? And he even made up a different disease to explain the resistance of slaves to oppression. He just made up a completely different disease, okay? So, and he even and this is from one of the PBS websites, he even explicitly says when he's talking about that disease that although the behavior of slaves appears as if it's intentional, it's not, it's pathological, okay? So this is a case where we have dogmatism producing and compounding false beliefs. It's producing more false beliefs. And last problem, bad epistemic effect for the agent that I could think of, I'm happy to hear what you guys can think of, is pursuing irrelevant inquiries. Okay, so closed-minded agents might pursue projects like, what are the causes of dropotomania? Okay, or a dogmatic climate denier might set out to study the environmental benefits of mining coal, okay? I think in these cases, we're seeing a waste of intellectual resources, a failure to pursue projects that are epistemically relevant, and thus opportunity costs. Okay, there are also bad effects for other agents. A bunch of them. And again, I'll be delighted to hear what you all think. So first bad effect for other agents is credibility deficit. So in being closed-minded with respect to sources, you might fail to see another person as a source of knowledge when she is. And Miranda Fricker calls that a credibility deficit. And when that is fueled by identity prejudice, that kind of closed-mindedness can be systematic, and it can track people across domains. Fricker thinks that in those cases, people who suffer from credibility deficits, she says, are, quote, wronged in their capacities as givers of knowledge, right? So a closed-minded person won't see that agent as a knowing agent, won't see that person as a source of knowledge, even though she is. So if she happens to cross the path of the closed-minded person won't notice her. And there will be some occasions where closed-minded people go out looking for sources. If the closed-minded person does that, then he'll just pass right over her. He's not going to notice her as a source. Okay? Connected to this idea of credibility deficit and closed-mindedness, when it takes the form of testimonial injustice, it doesn't have to take that form, but when it does, it can also produce a loss of intellectual virtues. So women and people of color whose credibility is systematically overlooked or denied, right, may come to doubt their own strengths. And if that happens, it can impede their ability to develop virtues like intellectual humility. So in losing confidence, they might under-own or fail to see their intellectual strengths, and they might erode any intellectual pride they already have. So that's the second problem. Third bad effect is exclusion and obstruction. So sometimes when we have a long history of this in the West and all over the world, sometimes when women and people of color are not seen as sources of knowledge, they are not seen as educable, and they are thus excluded from higher institutions of learning and even lower ones, okay? And in being excluded from schools and universities, women and people of color are prevented from gaining knowledge and prevented from developing intellectual virtues. Couple more bad epistemic effects that closed-mindedness can cause for other agents. Interestingly, one of them is credibility excess, too. So, and again, think about the epistemic bubble case. Here, the closed-minded agent who fails to look for sources outside the bubble, right, might assign too much credibility to his friends inside the bubble, okay? And in overestimating the credibility of your friends, that can interestingly cause them harm. They might become epistemically arrogant or lazy, okay? And the last point here is epistemic corruption. So closed-minded agents who are in positions where they get to set the intellectual agenda for other people, like professors, for instance, right? Or school boards, or governmental agencies, or journal editors, or journalists, are all in positions where they get to set the intellectual agenda for other people. If they're closed-minded, that might facilitate closed-mindedness in other people as well. And Ian Kidd calls that phenomenon epistemic corruption. When somebody who's in a position of power in the intellectual realm creates conditions that make it likely that someone else is going to get epistemic vices, epistemic corruption. Okay, so really quickly, let me just say a couple of quick things about responsibilist vice and personalist vice. So I think there are going to be multiple motives that can be associated with a person who has the responsibilist vice of closed-mindedness. You might have closed-mindedness as a character trait because you think it's important to protect the beliefs you already have. Or you think it's more important to avoid challenges to your worldview than it is to get the truth. I think that's the sort of classic motive that's associated with closed-mindedness, but I think there are lots of others that are also associated with closed-mindedness. So we might be unwilling to engage with options because we're lazy, or we're just incurious, we just don't care. Or we might be unwilling to engage with options because it's threatening to us, or we're afraid. I think there are lots of motivations. We might even fail to engage with options because we care about the truth, but we have false beliefs about how to get it, right? So I think, for instance, we see this, I think, in the Taliban, right? So they seem to care about the truth. They just think that the only way to get the truth is by believing what they already believe. So their motivation is a bad motive. It's bad in the sense that it's de re bad, right? But it's, in some sense, de dicto good. But I think it's in fact bad. What's interesting about responsibilist vice is that when we have it, it can sometimes fly under the radar. So if somebody has, somebody's closed-minded, and their closed-mindedness is so integrated with their character that they legitimately believe that open-mindedness is a bad thing, and it's better to believe in accordance with the status quo, or it's better to be conservative about our beliefs, or to believe in accordance with authority, say, then that person may actually think that what they're doing is the right thing. So there's an example I just want to point out here. This is in 6-4. Eric Jentsch, who was a Nazi psychologist, and he explicitly argued that open-mindedness is a symptom of psychological morbidity. Okay, so he thought it was a bad thing. And he viewed consistency, stability, firmness, and decision-making confidence as good, and open-mindedness is bad. An interesting thing about responsibilist vice is that it requires blame. I think that there are clearly cases where some of us are responsible for becoming closed-minded, at least partly responsible for becoming closed-minded, because we have control over whether we were going to perform the actions that made us closed-minded. But there's some cases where that doesn't happen, and I think we see that in the indoctrinated person. So in the indoctrinated person, and here I'm thinking of kids who were raised by Hitler's, what was called the Jugend, his school, or kids who today are being raised by ISIS or the Taliban. So it seems to me that they end up with closed-mindedness, right? When they are teenagers, when they come out, when they're no longer kids, they're teenagers or they're adults, they're unwilling or unable to engage with relevant intellectual options. And most of the time, they have the motivational and value system to back that up. They have bad motives and values that are integrated with that unwillingness or inability. But they're not blameworthy for it, at least not blameworthy for coming to get it in the standard voluntarist sense of blame that requires control, because they didn't have control. They had the bad luck of being in that environment. But I think they're still closed-minded, and I think that if we embrace non-voluntarist analyses of blame, there's still going to be plenty of blame to go around there. So it's not that they're blameless. They're not. They're just not blameworthy in the normal way. Yeah, okay. And one last thing, just one final question. I just want to end with our parting question, which is closed-mindedness always vicious? Is it always a vice? Or are there instances of closed-minded action that produce more good epistemic effects than bad ones? Or in environments like 1984, right, could the disposition of closed-mindedness even be an effects virtue and not a vice? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, so, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this. I mean, the way I've been thinking about these two concepts of, I should be on the mic. the way I've been thinking about these two concepts is that I've been thinking about dogmatism as more narrow than closed-mindedness. And so I think dogmatism requires this unwilling attitude. And that, I mean, thinking about it, that seems right to me. We wouldn't call somebody dogmatic who's unable, but willing. But I don't know. I mean, I might be convinced otherwise on that. But I think that's where the attitude comes in. And I think, although, yeah, that can be tricky with the indoctrinated people. That can be tricky, though. Because with the indoctrinated people, so the people who are raised by ISIS, right? They might, you know, I don't know, they might be willing to consider alternatives. It's just they're completely unable to, because their entire character is built so that they can't. But I don't know, that's a hard case. So I agree that attitude comes in. And the way I've been thinking of close-mindedness is that there are going to be some cases of close-mindedness, not all, but some, where it is just an inability. But those are going to look radically different from cases where it's a full-blown character trait. So I think there might be, for instance, certain disorders that would render somebody close-minded because they're just not able to consider relevant alternatives. And I think in that kind of case, I want to say, yes, the person's still close-minded, but that's not a very interesting fact about them, right? The close-mindedness is just a result of some hardwired, some hardwired disability or disorder. And so it's definitely not a character trait in them. It doesn't reflect who they are as people. It doesn't reflect their values and motives or attitudes at all. So it's just it may not even be a personality trait, depending on how we define that, but it's definitely not a character trait, and it's not blameworthy in any sense. So I think there's space for both. And I also, the way I'm talking about values and motives may be similar to the way you're thinking about attitudes too.
Yeah. I was thinking contemporary debates on epistemic disagreements. If you take disagreements among peers, epistemic peers, how does your view factor into that debate? And who is going to be blamed when two epistemic peers disagree about a certain issue?
Yeah. So that's a good question. And I haven't thought about how this will play out with epistemic peers. I mean, what I'm inclined, here's one, so I haven't thought about this, so this is a really good question. One thing I'm inclined to say is that if they're genuinely epistemic peers, however we're defining that, then the options that the epistemic peer is raising are going to be relevant. So I guess, one thing to say is that if we dismiss or ignore or fail to notice those options, then we are being close-minded. I think it's so I would have to say that if we're just dismissing, we're being close-minded. Now, it might be an interesting follow-up question to think about whether close-mindedness in that case is virtuous or vicious. Yeah. So okay, good. So in the long version of this paper, there's a little clause I add that has to do, there always is, right? That has to do with belief revision. So because, and that's really great that you pointed that out, because this doesn't say anything about belief revision. And especially, philosophers are really interested in belief revision, and so are psychologists. When they talk about close-mindedness, they are all about belief revision. So I add a sort of codicil saying that if you're engaging with somebody else, right, you're seriously engaging with them. You're not blowing them off. You're really, you're legitimately weighing what they have to say. But then when it comes to the point where you've gotten so much evidence or whatever it is that you should revise your belief, you just balk, right? At that point, I think you're still being close-minded. Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. Yeah.
So I had a kind of a question related to the parting question.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. In particular, I was wondering about the possibility of if you've reached truth, and if when you have reached truth, would it not then be virtuous to basically, I've reached it, close-mindedness? Yeah.
Beautiful question. Okay, so there are a couple things to say about that. So one thing is, so I could have the true belief that my greyhound Pixie is well behaved, and I could be dogmatic about it, okay? Now, if it's just a true belief and it's not knowledge in an ordinary environment, okay, so we're not in 1984, we're not doing some weird, okay, just like today, right? Professor Woodruff comes to me and says, Pixie was chewing the furniture, right? And I just dismiss it. Okay, so in a case like that, right, I have a true belief, right, but I'm being dismissive. I think in cases like that, the dogmatism can still be bad, because what might be happening is that you're still preventing yourself from gaining knowledge or understanding. So, and this is tricky. So if it's just a true belief, and I'm dogmatic about it, I don't have some of the bad effects that I listed, right? I'm not sustaining a false belief because my belief's true and so on. But I might still be preventing myself from getting knowledge, because it could be that close-mindedness obstructs knowledge. It prevents me from getting knowledge. So there's some literature on this issue. So Kripke actually talks about this. He calls it the dogmatism paradox. He's now not just talking about true belief, but talking about knowledge. And the question is whether when you know something, so not just true belief, but you now know it, is it okay to just ignore everything else? You've reached the knowledge. You have it. You've got a true justified belief and everything you need to shut Gettier up forever. Okay? So you've got it all, right? In that case, is it okay to be dogmatic? And philosophers are split on this issue, right? So some philosophers, like Qasim Qassam, think that if you're dogmatic, when you know, you lose your knowledge as a result of being dogmatic. Some philosophers, like Ernie Souza, think that you keep one, he's got more than one kind of knowledge. So he says you keep your animal knowledge, but you lose your reflective knowledge. So you still have some knowledge, but you just don't know that you know, or you don't know how you know.
So you keep considering that 2 plus 2 may be more than just 4, that it may be possibly 5. You're saying that you would imply you have to keep open to that.
The idea is that if you don't keep open to it, you could lose something that's epistemically good that you currently have. Yeah. So if you shut yourself off, this is a great question. So if you know something, and it seems like that would be a sort of obvious case where close-mindedness would be a virtue, right? Where you know something and you say, all right, I'm out. I got knowledge, I'm moving on. No more, okay? And in that kind of case, now the 2 plus 2 equals 5 case is a weird case because it's not going to be relevant in our ordinary environment. So it has to be a relevant option, like the Pixie case, or it could be more important than the Pixie case, right? But something relevant. So some people think that when you're in that situation and you shut yourself down, you lose the knowledge. You can retain the true belief, but you lose its status as knowledge. Other people think that you can still maintain its status as knowledge. So that's up for grabs, I think. I think the jury's out on that. Fabulous question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, actually, my question was having to do with what is defined as an ordinary environment, especially today.
Good, yeah, great.
And as we've been
Perfect.
referencing it, because in our world, I've been seeing that more and more options, and even the ones that you've been listing, seem to be becoming more relevant. And I was thinking just especially online, for example.
Yep.
I have family members who are flat earth theorists and who constantly share these things online and are constantly spreading it. And looking at the amount of people who are following it online and the communities that are formed there, it is hard for me to kind of keep thinking that it is somehow like not ordinary anymore when this kind of knowledge is being normalized. And so I was just wondering, what is like the line for an ordinary environment? Do we have an obligation now that this kind of knowledge is normalized?
Yeah. Fantastic. You guys are asking great questions. Okay, so This is really funny that you bring up this example, because I was just talking with another philosopher, and he told me that his brother has just become a flat earther. So it's it's really interesting. Okay, so so here's my take on this. So I'm inclined to think, with respect to relevancy, okay, because the question here is, okay, if enough people in the environment think that the Earth is flat, does that make that option relevant? I'm inclined to think that it does. But it's tricky. So your question is like, where's the line? When does an ordinary environment become hostile? And I don't know how to answer exactly that question. But I think clearly 1984 is a hostile environment. And I also think clearly we're not there yet. Pretty clearly, we're not there yet. I mean, it would be significantly worse here. Now, things have changed a lot in the last year particularly, but the last couple of years, right? So things have changed a lot. So we're getting closer to that environment, but we're not there yet. So is our environment still an ordinary environment or not? It may depend on what topic we're talking about and what domain we're in, right? So in the context of going to your philosophy and theology classes, well, and your science classes. I mean, could you imagine your science professors, you know, like your geology professor engaging with the option that the Earth is flat? Okay, but in the context of university, it's not a relevant option. In the context of social media, it's tricky. And I think some of it depends on how ubiquitous it is, right? How ubiquitous it is. So I think 1984 is the clearest kind of case. We're several steps back from that, thankfully. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, could you be entering a hostile epistemic environment whenever you log on? Yeah. And then, I mean, you still get to escape because you get to go to school. What about people who don't, right? So what about people who are essentially, most of their communication is in that bubble, right? Yeah, they're mostly in a hostile environment. Yeah, so that's a fantastic question that I don't have an answer to. But one of my next projects, I'm hoping, I've got a bunch of vice things coming up, so I'm gonna be working on slackers, quitters, and procrastinators, and then I wanna do something on hostile environments and epistemic pollution. Because I think what's happening in your feed is your feed's getting polluted with falsehoods. Yeah.
I mean, just as follow-up, so then do we have different obligations depending on how ordinary the environment becomes? So we have one obligation in our university to take seriously scientific actions, and then another obligation online when tons of people are sharing flat earth conspiracy.
Yeah. Good. So I wouldn't put it in terms of obligation. I would put it in terms of whether it's virtuous or vicious, but I don't think that matters too much. I think that so you're just gonna see all my cards here. So I think that in hostile environments, and let's just assume for the moment that your media feed is a hostile environment. Okay, let's just assume that. So I think that in hostile environments, it's intellectually virtuous to be close-minded. So I think you'd actually produce more bad epistemic effects by seriously engaging with the option. Now, you know, these are family members, friends, and so on. You might be, you know, epistemology isn't everything. Okay, so that might be to some degree counterbalanced by important moral and practical effects that would be good. Like you're continuing to maintain, like my friend who's a philosopher whose brother is a flat earther, you know, in engaging with him, could that produce some good moral effects, good practical effects? He gets to maintain his relationship with his brother, which is important, right? But epistemically, he's just doing a service. right? He's just going through the motions. It's like a public service announcement, right? It's appropriate for him to be close-minded, I think, in that situation, epistemically. Yeah. But you're welcome to disagree with me. Yeah, so in this way, I think closed-mindedness is often going to be a vice. I think most of the time, in ordinary environments, in Mike's case and all these sort of paradigmatic cases, it's going to be a vice. But there are these cases in hostile environments where I am actually sort of pro-polarization. Yeah.
Professor, I sincerely appreciate your including, the community as an agent that can suffer from close-mindedness.
Yeah.
And my question is, and you made references to despotic communities like the ISIS and the Hitler, but you didn't make any reference to scientific, communities where scientific research, it takes place, so as to be able to see whether what is happening in our world today can also be resolved when we understand and appreciate that scientifically some people are being marginalized because of who they are or where they come from, that most of the research that we do are limited to a particular group of people. Can we extend this close-mindedness to the scientific area and research?
Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't say very much about today, but one of the sort of classic cases I think we're seeing of dogmatism and closed-mindedness, really in the last decade or so, is climate denial. So I think, now I don't think climate deniers have to be dogmatic or closed-minded, but I think in many cases that's the case. That's true. And I think that it's really interesting as to whether in our ordinary environment, climate denial, so claiming that global warming is not anthropogenic, that it's not the result of human cause, at least partly the result of human cause, right? It's really interesting to think about whether anthropogenic climate denial is even a relevant option, whether it should count as one. Now, it's out there in our environment. It's not ubiquitous in our environment. It's not everywhere, but it's out there. Does it even count as relevant? Yeah. So I would clearly count the scientific community as part of the community that, I'm a philosopher, so I'm sort of thinking of the philosophical community, but I would clearly count the scientific community as part of the community that helps determine which intellectual options are relevant. Clearly. I think there's no question about that. Besides, my mom's a scientist. If I didn't count her, she'd be really upset. Does that, yeah. Yeah.
So you may have just answered the question in how you handle that. So I was going to suggest a place of being closed-mindedness where I've recognized a relevant authority, and at that point I'm closed-minded to any other input, even though the community might be filled with it. So in particular, Peter's oncologist says this is the right way to treat his cancer, but there's a wide variety of other information in there about treating cancer in different ways. Right. Even other authorities that suggest other things. But it seems like it's necessary to be at that point closed-minded. I don't know whether I'm strong enough to call it virtuous to be closed-minded, but needs to be.
That's great.
I wondered if you develop the relevant authority as a basis for closed-mindedness.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, so I think that this is a really good example of a sort of one-off closed-minded action that might be intellectually virtuous, I think. Right? So at some point in making decisions about healthcare and medical issues, it's really important for us to be open-minded in the way we gather evidence and the way we weigh it, and to get more than one opinion, especially in serious cases and so on. But there's a point at which we have to stop doing that. So there's a point at which we have to ignore relevant intellectual options so that we can focus on making a decision. Now, in that case, in that particular case, closed-mindedness may be actually a moral virtue, because it's helping the effects it's producing are good moral effects, and it's it involves an intellectual process in that we're still shutting ourselves off from a relevant option, but we're shutting ourselves off from a relevant option for a reason that might be a moral reason. Yeah, rather than an intellectual reason. So it could, I mean, so I think that there are many traits that could count as both virtues and vices, like closed-mindedness will count as a virtue in some conditions, mostly a vice. And I think that there are many traits that could count as intellectual virtues or moral virtues, or intellectual vices or moral vices. So I think that's true of closed-mindedness. I think it's true of humility too. Yeah.
This is, I think, picking up on David's question. How would you distinguish between vicious closed-mindedness and a kind of prudential selective inattention?
Yeah.
Can you say more? Because I could imagine there could be lots of things that I would just ignore and not make attention to because I've got this project and this research agenda, and that's just going to be a distraction. Yeah,
great. That's a great question. So Adam and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, and so one of the examples I like, you used an example that I love to use, which is, you know, you have to start writing your dissertation sometime. Right? So, yeah, right, or right, so you're working on an article, you know 6 other things have just been published on it. You're not going to read them because you need to finish the article. Okay, so is that closed-mindedness? Yes, I think it is. Is it bad? No, I don't think it is. Does it fail to be bad for epistemic reasons, or does it fail to be bad for pragmatic reasons? I'm inclined to say that it fails to be bad probably for both of those reasons. So I think that epistemology involves inquiry. And when we're so I guess one way to put this is my picture of what counts as an epistemic reason might be a bit broader. Yeah, because I think that our epistemic reasons are going to be reasons that have to do with the way we conduct our inquiries. But that gets tricky because not every, like Dave just brought up an example where maybe not every reason is going to count as an epistemic reason, even though it has to, it's connected with inquiry in some way. And I don't have an answer to that. Yeah, but it's a really good question. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you guys for this time, and join me in thanking Professor Battaly.
Oh, thank you all so much. You guys were great. You were great.